Hello and welcome everybody to this Ask Us Anything webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're watching live, you can post questions as we are talking. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. This is being recorded, but you are not on camera. We are the only ones that are on screen. So please watch in a way that works for you. And if you are watching on catch up, thank you so much for rewatching this. You can't post questions live, but you can put comments and questions underneath. And as always, hit the like and share and do all of the usual stuff. We have had some brilliant questions submitted, but before we get started with those, I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to get us going.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. This is the second of our Ask Us Anything webinars, so it's great to see so many of you here, so thanks so much. If you don't know who we are, my name's Chris, this is Beck. We write a newsletter, Substack newsletter called Breakthroughs and Blocks that you might know of. We are also the authors of this fine book called Written How to Keep Writing and Build a Habit That Lasts. And we are coaches at the Written Academy, formerly Prolifico. We're kind of changing our name a bit. And at the Written Academy, we put on courses, coaching courses and plans and programs and stuff like that to help people get unstuck with their writing. You might also know that over the last few weeks, we've been theming our Breakthroughs and Blocks newsletter around the chapters of our book Written, and this month of August, we are kind of digging into the kind of distractions and interruptions and obstacles that we all face when we write, and thinking about some of the strategies to overcome those blocks and barriers that distract us. So we're really kind of starting by stopping in one sense. So thanks again for joining.
Yeah, so as Chris said, in that chapter of our book, chapter 6, which is called Stopping, we analysed some data looking at a bunch of writers who asked the question, like, what is going to get in the way of your writing in the next week? So we got them to anticipate the blocks, the barriers, the interruptions, the distractions that were underlying what they were doing. And I think it'd be helpful to just talk about that before we get to some of the questions, because I just want to reassure everybody that stopping is a completely normal part of the writing process. It's a part of the creative process. And everybody goes through that. And we're going to explain a little bit about why, and we're going to offer some really specific tips in answer to some of the questions. But to think about distractions and what stops us writing more broadly, I often talk about it in terms of internal distractions and external ones. Now, the external ones are the really obvious things that we think that kind of interrupt us, work, email notification, family, friends, pets, all the stuff that kind of pulls us away. And then the internal ones are the sorts of doubts and fears that cause sort of resistance and procrastination. And I thought it'd be really interesting to re-look at some of the data. We ask these questions a lot of writers. And so I got some more recent data. When we did it for the book, it was like deep in the kind of lockdown period. And I thought, actually, things have probably changed a little bit. And it was really interesting to look at what stops us writing now, here in 2023. And actually, we came up with some broader categories. So that first internal one is absolutely top. People really are held back by procrastination, self-doubt, insecurity, all those negative thoughts and feelings, perfectionism, and that lack of clarity and confidence. So that really is one of our top things that stop us writing. And then again, going back to the classic distractions. So these are the external things like digital, work, family. And life admin, that's a huge one that gets in the way. And then underneath that, there are these other subcategories, which I think are useful to talk about because they could probably fit underneath those two broad internal and external. But actually, they cause a real problem for writers. So I think we do need to give them some attention. You know, work is next. Family and personal commitments comes after that. Time management. Now, this was a really interesting one for us to look at because it came up so frequently in what gets in the way. And it can be everything from the classic scheduling interruptions, unplanned events, uncertainty, to the inability and the difficulty of planning how long it takes to write. And I think it's not a classic distraction, but actually it weighs so heavily on writers' minds. It's important for us to talk about that. Then there's physical and mental well-being, and finally these kind of environmental factors, which could be anything from temptations to seasonal distractions like sunshine, which if you have been lucky enough to have some, which we haven't here in Yorkshire. So those are very broadly some of the sorts of things. And I think it's helpful to think about the breadth of those distractions, because in seeing that things like I'm feeling hungry can stop me writing, can help you plan a bit more for it over the coming weeks and months as you tackle writing projects. If you want to read a bit more about that, we've got that in the Substack that went out today. I'm going to put the link in the show notes so everybody watching on Catch Up can see it there. So I just thought it's helpful to kick off really with this very broad map of distractions and the things that stop us writing.
And without wishing to get a bit too sort of noodly into distractions, it is the kind of thing that we've been thinking about and writing about for years and years and years. So it is interesting, that kind of internal and external split in terms of, and also how those two things are linked as well, and also thinking about you know, that some distractions are fundamentally harder to manage than others. Because a lot of times people kind of come to us in our courses or in our coaching and just say, you know, I get distracted, or I'm the kind of person that gets distracted. But I think it's really worth thinking about, if you're of that mind, it's worth thinking about what it is that you get distracted by. And this kind of comes back to our method in terms of reflection and noticing, because, you know, sometimes it will be, as Beck said, those kind of external distractions, the work email, the family, the pets, the kids, especially holiday times in the US, that distract us. And in some ways, those are actually relatively easy to manage. And we've talked before about the obstacle thinking process, and the whole idea about brainstorming different solutions, putting your phone in a different room, and all those kind of things. But at other times, there is like an underlying reason why we are becoming more distractible, if that kind of makes sense, or if we are in a more distractible state or frame of mind. And this can be for different reasons. Sometimes it's because you know, we are feeling unsure about ourselves. We're feeling unsure about the writing. Maybe we're not enjoying the writing. You know, we're feeling these feelings of low self-confidence. And when we feel like this, we often become more distractible, if that makes sense. But also there's other reasons why we become more distractible too. For example, we're just tired, or, you know, we've had a long day, or we just need a break. So it really, thinking about why it is you get distracted, what it is you get distracted by, and how you are distractible, if that kind of makes sense. I think it's really worth doing that. And again, this goes back to this whole idea of noticing when you get distracted, what is it that's pulling you away, reflecting on what is it that you can do to manage that. It might be a simple thing, might be a more complicated thing. It could be that you just need a break, get outside, do some exercise, go for a walk, that kind of thing.
Okay. We are going to give you, that's quite a broad overview, but it kind of outlines our approach. And what we're going to do is we're going to give much more specific tips in answer to questions. If you've got questions, pop them in the Q&A. It's just at the bottom there. And we will answer as many of them as we possibly can. We've also been sent, we've got lots here as well that we're going to run through now. And I'm going to start with one from Scott. Now, Scott asks about overcoming timid writing. And what he means by that is that he lacks confidence. So when he looks back onto writing as a child, it was so much easier to do it and to finish stuff. Whereas now, when he writes, he loses his confidence. This kind of timid mind takes over. And he just asks, how can I overcome this obstacle?
I think comparisons, and it's interesting because this is, in many ways, this is a question about comparison. But when we think about comparison, often we think of it in relation to how we compare ourselves to someone else who's better, someone else who does it more quickly, etc., 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 all these things. But actually, often comparison is of a different order, where we're actually comparing ourselves to ourselves or a different version of ourselves. And this is what I think Scott may be doing in terms of looking at how he is now as an adult and thinking, why can't I do that, the same thing as, you know, how can I write? Why can't I do it? Why can't I write in the same way that when I was a child? And it kind of made me think. So we've just come back off holiday, well, a couple of weeks ago, and we were with our niece called Olive, and Olive is 5, and it was the first couple of days of the holiday were just really rainy, and she wanted to bake a cake, and she really loved the process of baking and making this cake. But actually, it was horrendous. The outcome was absolutely horrendous. It was all blue and green splodges, and it tasted fairly awful. Being honest, I didn't say that to her, being a good uncle. But when we said to Olive, you know, do you like the cake? She's like, yes, this is the best cake I have ever made. I absolutely love it. And I just think that there's a sort of moral in that story, in that as adults, we often give ourselves an awful lot of a hard time, and we put ourselves under an awful lot of pressure, and that's because we're focusing on the outcome most rather than the process. And I just think it's worth returning sometimes to that sense of play and lightness that our niece Olive experiences when making a cake. I'm not saying that's easy, but I think often as adults we put ourselves under a lot of pressure. We make it far more serious and a lot more weighty than it perhaps could be, where we could just take a leaf out of, sort of adopt a child's mind for a moment and just think about how we could play around with ideas, lighten the task, go in smaller steps, and just make it slightly more fun than the onerous task that our adult brain often makes it into.
Yeah, I mean, it's often called beginner's mind, that kind of that process that I think is used in some sort of spiritual practices. And to pick up on Scott's question, I want to sort of talk again about how he's writing now and how all of us are often writing. And it is to celebrate the progress that we do make, that there is a time, you know, he's showing up, he's starting the writing. And yes, there are these kind of doubts and fears that are coming in, but actually celebrating the progress that can be made is incredibly important. So any way of noticing what you're doing, tracking it, seeing if, you know, how long can you pay attention for? And actually, this goes back to that sense of being distractible, that we often talk about how our attention is kind of been destroyed. And actually, it can be a little bit like something that you need to build up, like a muscle. So, you know, you might only be able to pay attention for 5 or 10 minutes. You know, how long is it before you start to have these worries and fears, and then build up from there? And I think this goes back to the idea of beginner, the sort of what's kind of the tiny habits and about how we change. And it's really important. The researchers, BJ Fogg, found that we change best by feeling good. So this idea of celebrating the small progress we make is going to make us more likely to come back and repeat it. And that is actually how habits are built. They're built in very small increments. And there's a quote I often return to, which I'm sure I have shared on many webinars that if you've watched before, you've probably heard me say, but I'm going to say it again because I find it really helpful. And it is from designer, author, and podcaster Debbie Millman. And she says that confidence is the successful repetition of any endeavor. And it's that sense that, you know, we have to keep showing up, and that repetition is what builds our confidence. And, you know, in the kind of the neuroscience of habits, that repetition is what builds the habit. It's what releases the dopamine that gives us that sense of confidence and keeping going. So Scott, there's lots of tips there. Focus on where you are now, take it in very small steps, celebrate the progress you make, and try and have fun with it. So feel good about your writing, bring in that beginner's mind, that childlike playfulness, and it will build up over time.
Okay, so we are on to a second question. This one is from Elizabeth. And she messaged about illness and when having treatment can't work at the normal speed. So that she has a challenge of getting started and sticking to a deadline and being kind to herself if she can't meet these smaller deadlines.
Yes, I just want to say thanks to Elizabeth for posting this question on our Substack. And I wanted to share it now because I know it's something that a lot of people experience. And again, it's a bit similar to Scott in that it's a comparison to how we were. So the difference between, you know, we look at how we write when we are younger, we might look at how we write when we are, you know, feeling at our physical best, when we're really healthy. And when that changes, it's really hard to accept that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this is really tough. And it's important that that is accepted, but that's really hard, a really hard thing to do. What Elizabeth is doing, she had a longer question. We're kind of trying to make these questions quite short so you can sort of get to the heart of them. But she is setting goals. She's got very clear deadlines and she's got milestones within them. And I think there is something that's really motivating about having a goal and a deadline. And goals are targets that we aim for, and often they give us a real feeling of excitement. There's a real tingle factor you can get from having goals. So it can be helpful, even if we're not feeling our best, to have some of these plans in place and to make them feel quite tangible. But the key is to not get too attached to them. So see them as a target, see what is achievable, and work towards them in small increments. And the really important part of her question, and I think she answers it herself, is how to be kind to herself. And I think noticing that you need to be kind is really important. That kindness can come in many ways. We often talk about something which we call a 10-minute test, which is a good example is like, you know, I don't really feel like writing, or I'm too tired to write today. Use that as a hypothesis, test out that assumption and see how you feel. So it might be that it's a day where you're not feeling at your best, but you're not sure whether to write or not. Just try it for a few minutes. And if you're not, you can stop and not feel guilty. Often it's the weight of expectation and the guilt of wanting to write and not being able to do it that can actually be more damaging. So that's one way of being kind to yourself, is just kind of going, actually, I can't write today, or I've tested and I can't write today. So I'm going to not write, and I'm not going to feel bad about it. I'm going to look after myself. I'm going to think about how to be kind to myself. Are there other writing tasks I can do that aren't as demanding? How can I reward myself for the writing that I do? That's a really important part of that keeping going process, attaching good things to the writing. And that, again, will keep you going much, much longer term.
Yeah, I've just never really thought about that whole idea of, it's almost like, because human beings, I think, want to close loops. And I think that the faster we can get to a point where we think, you know, so, you know, just hence why that 10-minute test is actually really quite worthwhile doing. If you can put a line under it and think, you know, I've tested this assumption out and I really can't do any writing, then that's fine. Then you've closed that loop and then you can actually move on. It's when we have open loops and we think, you know, maybe I should be doing something, maybe I should, and that's where these feelings of guilt can creep in, and those are the things that actually are far more damaging for us in many ways. Anyway.
No, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, kindness. We all need to be much, much kinder and more gentle with ourselves, and reward ourselves for the writing we do, and use that to keep going. More questions?
Yes, more questions. This is, I don't have a name for this one actually. Is this Diane, I think?
Yeah.
This is about resilience to keep going. So Diane is an experienced writer who emailed us again, I think, or was it on Substack? I can't remember. But publishing has changed. So the nature of publishing has changed. And for her, it feels like starting all over again. And she really, really wants to get back into a writing groove. How does she do it?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really tough one, because life is unpredictable, and we think we've just mastered something. Right, I know how to do this, I know how to write an article, I know how to submit it, I know what to do when it gets published, and then things change, and that is hard, and it definitely keeps us on our toes, and it brings me back to a quote that we shared. It's in the book, and we put it on the newsletter a couple of weeks ago, which was from Kathy Rensenbrink. She is a memoirist, a novelist, and the author of a brilliant writing guide called Write It All Down. And she told us, she said, I'm going to read this out actually. She says, it's a seductive myth that if we start writing on day one, then we will gradually get better and more confident as time goes on. In my experience, this is simply not true, because writing is a tug of war between desire and fear, and therefore feels much more like hazardous zigzagging. And when I talk to people about this quote, a lot of people really do feel that sense of zigzagging, that there are ups and downs, and it also kind of gives us some resistance to it as well, because we do want to think that if the more I write, the better I'll get. You know, it's kind of like that's how we've been taught. You know, the more we do of something, the easier it will become. But when we looked at the kind of the science of expertise, which is called mastery, which is the work of Anders K. Ericsson, often called the 10,000 hours rule or the 10-year rule. He says in order to master something, we're always working at the edge of our ability. So we're always stretching ourselves. And if you look at writers' careers, sometimes they choose to do that. It might be why we get rather annoyed with some of our favorite novelists when they suddenly decide to write in a completely different genre or try something a bit more experimental. We want them to do the same thing, but the point is they know how to do that, and they want to do something different, so they're pushing themselves and trying something new. And I think sometimes we choose to do that in terms of mastery, and sometimes the world changes around us, and we're forced to adapt and change. And that really comes down to this important part about resilience. You know, how do we keep going when something has changed? And again, it's acknowledging that things have changed and then trying to look at that afresh with curiosity, using the experience that you've got, the resilience that you have built over a lifetime of writing, and applying that to this new environment.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add to that is that I know Diane is a copywriter as well, which is what I kind of do or have done quite a lot of in my career. And actually, it is very easy. It's quite a fast-paced thing. And if you've been away from it for a while, this is more kind of practical advice, more sort of careers advice more than anything. It is quite easy to think that you're out of touch, that your skills aren't worthwhile anymore, etc., etc. But fundamentally, copywriting and is writing. So actually, it's really worth thinking about what it is that you can bring that maybe other people cannot bring. Yeah, they might be really good on social media, but actually, they might not be able to bring the insight and experience that you do. So just because the world has moved on, don't necessarily always think that that your skills are not worthwhile. You just might need to adapt them in some way.
Yeah, and it's
which is what I've done.
Yeah, and it's that sense of experimenting and trying new things and keeping going. We sometimes talk about something called the quantity myth, that we don't actually know what is good. We're quite poor judges of our own writing, and the only way to figure out what is good, what's going to work, what people are going to commission and publish, is to keep doing it. So it's a kind of an argument for, I suppose, productivity and output in a sense, but it is also that sense of like, you keep going and then you move on and you learn from that experience. And it does involve a little bit of experimentation, which is trial and error, a bit of failure, and then seeing it, not that you've failed, but that experiment has failed. So try something else.
Shall we move on to a question about apps?
Yes.
This one. So ES, I don't know what that stands for. Is there an app to help you stick with a writing schedule?
I love this.
So, if there is one, can you let us know?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm wobbling the table.
So I love, we get asked about technology a lot, and actually in the sort of history of our business, we released an app ourselves. It's no longer existing out there, but it was a really interesting experiment, and it taught us a lot about writing apps. And I have worked in that kind of startup field and with sort of quite a lot of publishers on technology. So this is something that I do know quite a lot about. But the longer I've worked in it, the more I realize is that technology isn't always the answer, but it can be a really helpful tool in your broader toolkit. And some of the simplest apps in terms of helping you stick to a schedule are things like your calendar. And this comes down to preference. You know, are you the sort of person who likes to put in, you know, writing appointments? It's something I put an appointment in my calendar. Chris never would. I don't think you've ever put a writing appointment in your calendar. You've never said between 10 and 11, I'm writing X, Y, or Z. No. So very, very different approaches in terms of personality, but scheduling tools can be really helpful for that. Tracking tools can be really nice, and something as simple, we talk about celebrating progress. And one way of doing that is having a writing streak. So writing every single day. So something like a Streaks app is really helpful if that's the sort of thing that motivates you. I have found that when I have used some of those Streaks apps, if I break a streak, I get so annoyed and upset. It actually puts me off my writing rather than puts me off the app. So it can be a little bit counterproductive. So you've got to be a bit careful about that. And things like timers are some of the simplest things you can do. We talk a lot about the Pomodoro. There are tons of Pomodoro apps and timers out there. You can set a simple 25 minutes on your own phone. I like to use the Amelia timer, but to be honest with you, I kind of go quite old school, and I have one of these on my desk, and I'm more likely to use that for a quick writing sprint. So ES, in answer to your question, there's tons of apps, there's tons of things out there. Have a go, experiment, see what works for you. Don't use it as a form of procrastination.
That's exactly, I was just about to say, it's amazing how I was just no, sorry.
No, you do it. You finish that point.
No,
you finish it.
I mean, it's amazing how many people spend far more time looking and searching for a miracle app cure for their writing productivity than actually doing any writing. So I'm sure might not be you, but just bear that in mind, that sometimes we really, really like the search rather than the actual doing of the writing. So just have a think about whether that's something that you might be doing as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we just had a question come in about being about procrastination and about being lazy, and I just wanted to talk about this a little bit, because I think I said right at the beginning that getting distracted and stopping writing is completely normal. And I just think it might be helpful to talk a little bit about some of the, you know, what it is and why we do it. And the simplest reason for us getting distracted and procrastinating and being lazy is that we are human. What we do is when we tackle something hard like writing, we will have some resistance to that, and our mind, our brain wants to protect us. The primitive part of our survival system is going to look for something easier to do, and that's all that procrastination is. When confronted with a difficult task, it will look for something easier to do, and that is completely and utterly normal. And I've got a quote here that, again, I often return to and I do find super helpful, which is from writing productivity researcher, the kind of, I suppose, the granddaddy of it, who was doing the research in the 80s and 90s, Dr. Robert Boyce, who wrote a book called Procrastination and Blocking, which kind of is, it's brilliant. And he has this definition, and I'm going to read this out because I think you might take some comfort in it. So procrastination means putting off a difficult, delayable, important task, an act with a distant, perhaps doubtful rewards, as in writing, in favour of something easier, quicker, and less anxiety-provoking. For example, cleaning a desk before writing. He goes on to say that blocking is often similar. It occurs when we stumble, delay, and panic in response to a demanding responsibility, when we avoid the threatening task by way of nervous slowing down of activity, self-conscious narrowing of scope, even immobilization. Blocking typically occurs when we face public scrutiny, as in a writing block. And I find that this, for me, has been the best definition of procrastination for writers and of writer's block. And at heart, as I said before, it's just a normal human response to a difficult task by seeking to do something easier. And I think Chris's point about noticing really gets to the heart of that, because if we suddenly have a great desire to organize our references, our bibliography, to tidy our desk, as Robert Boyce says, notice that we're doing it and then start to ask, what are we doing? Why are we doing that? And we can get to the root of that. And it goes back to the piece of advice that, again, that we give often and is worth repeating. The best way to overcome this difficult task is to make the task easier. So how can you scale back your writing so it becomes smaller, easier, and, dare I say, more fun? That goes back to Scott's question at the beginning. And sometimes I think a good test for that is, can you think of a writing task, a first step, which is as easy as the procrastination? And I would say, we ask writers what they do instead of their writing, and sometimes their procrastination activities are quite complicated and quite complex. Why do we suddenly decide that we need to deep clean the kitchen, wipe all the surfaces and empty the dishwasher? That can be a damn sight harder than opening up our work in progress, reading the last sentence and writing another word.
It's again, this has just struck me that a lot of the questions today have actually been about comparison in one way or another, comparison to others, comparison. I mean, again, calling yourself lazy is quite a loaded term, quite a self-critical critical term, and also lazy compared to what. And it just struck me that a lot of these points are around whether comparing ourselves to others, comparing ourselves to a former version of ourselves when we were a child, and all those kind of things.
Yeah. Okay, I've got another question here. Can writing non-stop to finish a draft help authors on a long-term career? This is quite an interesting question, because there's kind of like two parts to that, because it's like, can like going all out on writing help you finish a draft? Yes, it can. But the second part is that helpful for a long-term career? And I suppose the answer is that, only if it's sustainable.
It depends.
Do you want to talk a bit about this, or should we talk a bit about, because it might be something around the different ways that writers write and make time, talking a bit about binge writing, seeing as we've mentioned Dr. Robert Boyce.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes, again, goes back to the whole kind of issue around noticing as well. Sometimes the process that you have doesn't necessarily have to be, if you've noticed the fact that your process is to binge write at the end of a project or something like that. I often say this to people who, if they don't want to do that, they have to first start sort of noticing where in their process that actually, whether that works for them and not, or not. And sometimes it can actually work for people. And if that is your process, then that is your process. And you have to decide whether it's something you want to change or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, we often talk about having deadlines for goals, and deadlines are really helpful. They give you something very specific to aim towards, and there is this kind of deadline effect. It exerts pressure on you, and it kind of forces you to pull out the stops. And many of us will have had experiences when we were probably younger, it might be now, but definitely when we were younger, where we had to submit an essay or do some homework or get something in for a specific deadline, and we kind of pull all the stops out to do that. And sometimes it's really surprising what we're capable of, so much more than we thought. But also it's absolutely exhausting. And this is what, when Robert Boyce talks about the kind of binge writing, he sees this as this kind of panicked last minute thing, and long term it's really poor for writing outcomes, and he's got tons of research on this. But we have actually found it's a bit more subtle when you look at how writers write, and as Chris said, that can be part of your process. And if it's important for you to have a binge write, I mean, for me and my own writing, I like to go on a writing retreat. I go to there's a place called Gladstone's Library over in North Wales that I go to just for a couple of nights. I don't go for very long, but I have to clear my calendar, I have to organize it months, weeks in advance, and I go away and I write all the time. And it's amazingly productive, but it's quite rare. So this kind of deep writing, or this intentional binge writing, can be a really helpful part of your process. However,
sorry, no, I was just going to say, I think the more you can do in writing and in life, really, to gain a sort of control over these things. So the more if you know that binge writing in these long, intense chunks of time is something that you use, is something that you can use to your advantage, then rather than let it creep up on you, that is when it'll probably be damaging, because that is when it'll probably be exhausting. Yeah. If you know that kind of thing can work for you, then booking it in advance, or as Beck does, I mean, I'm not saying everybody could do this, but no, a version of that, in terms of having an intense time, heads down time to do some writing, is a way to actually manage it and control it. And the more you can control it, the more in control you feel. And I just think, as human beings, we actually value sort of autonomy and control over our lives. And I think one thing we've seen over and over again, actually, is when people feel out of control of the writing process, then that is the thing that causes the stress. That is the thing that does the damage. And that's the reason why people come to dislike the writing process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think, so looking at kind of writing careers and sustainability, if you are someone who likes to binge write, if you are someone who likes to push yourself towards a deadline, you need to find a way of doing that is sustainable for you. I mean, I have read, I've lost count of the number of famous writers I've read who wrote their whole draft in a week, in a month, in 6 weeks, that kind of like that, what feels, unbelievable amount of words that they can churn out in a very short space of time. What we don't often hear is that they might not have looked at it for weeks or months or years afterwards, that what their rest looked like. It goes back to that idea of zigzagging. Do you have moments where you push yourself and then you pull back and relax? What isn't unsustainable is working at that rate all the time. And we hear a lot about burnout, and it is as true for writers as it is for other careers. So yeah, if you're interested in a long-term career, you need to build in periods of rest alongside the productivity. Now, I'm really aware of time and that we are pretty much out of it. I don't think we've got time for any more questions, so I'm really sorry if we haven't answered yours. what might be helpful is just to wrap up on a few points around stopping and distraction and give you some practical tips if that's helpful, because I'm aware that we've mentioned a few things but not really explored what they mean, and one of them was around obstacle thinking, and this comes from the work of Professor Gabrielle Ottingen, whose name I always pronounce incorrectly. I am so sorry.
No, so obstacle thinking, it is a very simple but actually really, really powerful method that we get everybody to do right at the beginning of our coaching courses and programs, either one-to-one coaching or whatever, which is quite simply to look look at your diary, whether it's even in a way that works for you. It could be the next day, could be the next week, could be the next month, and simply start to note down what it is that may well get in the way of your writing over that period of time. Brainstorm, write as many things as you can. Some of those things may be new things, so there could be new meetings, or there could be, I don't know, holidays or whatever it is, things that might get in the way of your writing. Other things might be more familiar to you, you know, your kids, the dog, etc., etc., etc. These things are more regular. It sounds simple, but actually once you know where these distractions are coming from, you're in a far better place to manage them. And again, it goes back to that whole idea of taking back a little control, and so you're not sort of at the whims of your distractions, that you know that you're likely to have this distraction or this interruption from this place at this certain time.
Yeah, so it's simply anticipating what's going to come up and making a plan for it, and it can be absolutely transformative, and if you work with us, you'll hear about us talking about obstacle thinking, and if you are interested, check out WOOP, WOOP, which is the kind of work that it's based on, which is a brilliant and very clear structure.
And I'm sorry, I was just going to say, and even like almost like the pro version of obstacle thinking is then, as Beck sort of touched on, is then having a little plan.
Yeah.
So if you get distracted by this, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
If you get an hour of your writing time if you get pulled into a meeting by your colleague or something, then I will put in another hour in the evening or later in that day. So it's just a way to manage those obstacles and have a plan, so you don't lose that writing time. That's all.
Yeah, and it's to sort of take out that kind of tussle you have with willpower and guilt when you lose a writing session, or you get distracted, or you get a pull away. You know, you've got something really tangible you can do about it. So that's one tip that I want you to really think about. So plan for your obstacles, think what they are. The other one is, if you're not sure what's going to get in the way, we do encourage people to keep a bit of a distraction diary. It can just be back of an envelope right next to your desk. When you are writing, what's stopping you? And make a note of it. So start to think about those external things. Are you being interrupted by people, by work, by notifications? Are they the internal doubts and fears? Are you middle of a sentence and suddenly goes, oh, no one's going to want to read this, and that stops you in your tracks? Make a note of it, and you will start to see patterns. So the key thing to do is to make a note of it, but do it in a very kind non-judgmental way, and then you can do that obstacle thinking process to come up with practical plans to deal with the things that are really happening to you at the and stopping you writing. We are pretty much out of time, so I want to say thank you so much for your time, for your attention, for all your brilliant questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to answer them all. We will post the recording on YouTube, send it out to everybody who signed up. Thank you so much, and we will see you very soon.
Thank you, guys.
Bye then.
Bye.